road in Cauca, a Sunday, an explosive charge buried beneath the asphalt. There are no numbers yet, no official statements, no television cameras, only silence and smoke. And when the smoke begins to clear, what remains is a question Colombia has spent decades trying not to ask. When did the war here actually end? Cauca, a name that in Colombia no longer needs explanation. It is one of the most resource-rich regions in the country and one of the poorest in state presence. Land of mining, coca, dense jungle, and indigenous communities that have spent decades trapped in a war they never chose. The bombing did not dominate headlines for long. It did not stop the country. It did not interrupt the broadcast. Colombia has spent too many years living with this kind of violence for one more explosion to trigger national paralysis. And that is exactly the problem. Because this was not an isolated attack. In recent years, the use of improvised explosive devices in Colombia has not disappeared. It has evolved, it has spread, it has become harder to trace, harder to attribute, harder to contain. There is no longer a single armed actor, no single front line. There is a fragmented logic of terror now, distributed across multiple hands, and those hands have learned how to use it. Cauca, Catatumbo, Bajo Cauca, Colombia's Pacific coast. The names change, the geography changes. Armed groups change their acronyms, their rhetoric, their flags, but the mine remains buried. The bomb remains in the road. And that says something no official statement is willing to admit with clarity. Colombia is not entering a new wave of violence. Colombia is watching the return of a war that never truly ended. On September 26, 2016, Colombia did something very few countries in modern history have managed to do. It signed peace with the oldest guerrilla insurgency in the Western Hemisphere. After more than 50 years of armed conflict, after hundreds of thousands of deaths, after millions displaced, after massacres, kidnappings, landmines, bombings, and entire towns trapped between fear and abandonment, Colombia and the FARC sat down in Havana and signed a peace agreement. The world applauded. Juan Manuel Santos was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. And for a moment, Colombia believed it was watching the end of its war. For the first time in decades, there was something the country barely remembered how to feel: hope. But signing peace and building peace are not the same thing. And Colombia was about to learn that the hard way. To understand why peace never arrived, you have to understand where the war came from. And that means going back to the part of Colombia that was easier to ignore than to fix. The second half of the 20th century began in Colombia with a war so brutal it barely needed a formal name. They called it simply La Violencia, a savage conflict between liberals and conservatives that left at least 200,000 people dead between 1948 and 1958. Rural massacres, villagers executed for the color of their ballot, a country split between political factions while the countryside bled. That trauma was never processed, never repaired, never resolved. It was buried. And from that burial, something deeper emerged, more ideological, more durable. In 1964, in the mountains of Tolima, a group of armed peasants shaped by decades of rural exclusion and influenced by Marxist thought founded the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, the FARC. In the beginning, the FARC did not emerge as an anomaly. They emerged as the product of a historical fracture. Land concentrated in a few hands. Rural communities without rights. A state that arrived with soldiers but not with schools, hospitals, or credit. What began as a peasant insurgency eventually became something much larger and much darker. The 1980s changed everything. Colombia did not invent drug trafficking, but it became one of its global centers of gravity. As Colombian cocaine began generating impossible fortunes, and the Medellin and Cali cartels turned violence into industry, the guerrillas understood something essential. Cocaine was power. The FARC began by taxing coca growers and laboratories. Then they controlled routes. Then they controlled territory. By the 1990s, they were no longer just an ideological insurgency. They were also a criminal structure with military capacity, territorial control, and an economy of their own. And with that money, they bought something they had never had before: scale. At their peak, the FARC had a presence across much of the country. They could overrun towns, kidnap civilians, shoot down aircraft, plant landmines, control strategic corridors, and directly challenge the state. And in many of those regions, the Colombian state had not lost control. It had never truly had it. That is one of the most uncomfortable truths in this story. There is a version of Colombia's conflict that is too simple and still widely repeated: a democratic state fighting violent armed groups. It is not false, but it is incomplete, because Colombia's armed conflict was not only the result of violent ideologies or criminal organizations, it was also the result of a historic failure of the state to truly reach its own citizens. For decades across vast parts of the country, the state arrived in only one form: in uniform. It did not arrive with teachers, it did not arrive with judges, it did not arrive with doctors. It did not arrive with roads, land titles, drinking water, credit, or functioning institutions. It arrived with soldiers, and when the state arrives only with a rifle, someone else arrives to fill the vacuum, with rules, with justice, with order. First the FARC, then the ELN, then the paramilitaries, then criminal gangs, then dissident factions. The names changed, the vacuum did not, and that is what no peace agreement can solve on its own. Because peace agreements are signed between armed actors. But the vacuum that produces them is only filled by institutions, by continuity, by investment, and by a state willing to remain. And Colombia still has not solved that. The negotiations in Havana lasted 4 years. The final agreement was ambitious: rural reform, political participation, end of conflict, illicit drugs, victims, implementation. In many ways, it was the most serious attempt Colombia had ever made to address not only the symptoms of war, but its structural causes. Then something happened that reshaped the legitimacy of the process from the start. Colombia voted and said no. In 2016, the peace deal was rejected in a national plebiscite by a razor-thin margin. The agreement was revised, adjusted, implemented through Congress, but the political fracture was already open, and it would define everything that came next. Roughly 13,000 FARC fighters demobilized. It was real, historic, significant, but it was never enough because the FARC were never the only armed actor, and demobilizing them did not demobilize the war. The ELN never joined the agreement. Dissident factions never disappeared. And in the territories the FARC left behind, the state did not arrive first. Others did. The ELN, dissident FARC factions, the Clan del Golfo, local criminal structures with no national name but real territorial control. In many regions, the withdrawal of the FARC did not produce peace. It produced a succession war, a violent struggle over coca, smuggling routes, illegal mining, and armed mobility corridors. And in that struggle, the first to die were not commanders. They were community leaders, human rights defenders, the people who survived the war and were murdered in peace. Since the peace accord was signed, more than 1,300 social leaders and human rights defenders have been killed in Colombia, according to civil society and international monitoring groups. More than 300 former FARC fighters have also been killed after laying down their weapons. That number is not just about violence. It is about message. If that is what happens to those who demobilize, the message to those still armed is brutally clear. The agreement promised reintegration, security, and life after war. In too many cases, that promise arrived late or incomplete or not at all. And in the meantime, recruitment continued. The war changed shape. It did not disappear. Colombia produces roughly 70% of the world's cocaine, according to recent international estimates. That number sustains a central part of this story. Drug trafficking is not just a crime, it is an economy. It has supply, demand, labor, routes, exports, margins, and armed structures built to defend it. As long as that economy exists, there will be armed actors willing to fight for control of it. The peace agreement promised crop substitution. On paper, it made sense. In practice, it was far more difficult. For thousands of rural families, coca is not ideology, it is survival. And when the state offers substitution without roads, without markets, without security, without reliable income, the return is not political. It is economic. And the armed group controlling that territory understands that better than anyone. Coca cultivation did not disappear after the peace accord. It grew. And with it, so did the incentive for new armed actors to occupy the space the FARC left behind. In 2018, Ivan Duque took office. In 2022, Gustavo Petro followed. 2 different governments, 2 different political visions, 2 different approaches to peace. And yet, the same limit remained. Negotiation is not enough when the territory is still empty. Implementation slowed, rural reform stalled, State presence remained uneven. Petro arrived promising total peace, but total peace collided with a fragmented reality. Groups that negotiate and shoot, that sign ceasefires and keep recruiting, that speak the language of peace while still burying explosives in the roads of Cauca. And that brings this story to its most uncomfortable point. The people paying for this war without ever choosing to fight it. Indigenous communities, Afro-Colombian communities, farmers, local leaders, the people who live in territories where peace is not determined by an agreement in Bogota, but by whichever armed group controls the road that week. For many communities in Cauca, peace was never a signed document. At best, it was a fragile pause. Now, not even that. So we return to the beginning, to the shattered road, to the smoke, to the explosive buried beneath the asphalt. What does that explosion mean? It means armed groups are still sending the same message. We are still here. We still have capacity. The state has not defeated us. In Colombia, explosives do not only kill, they communicate. Every bomb is a territorial message. Every landmine is a declaration of control. Every shattered road is a way of saying the war is still active. Did Colombia return to war? The most honest answer is not exactly, because to return to something, you first have to leave it. And Colombia never fully did. The 2016 peace accord was real. It reduced violence. It saved lives. It changed entire regions. That matters a great deal. But it was an incomplete peace signed in an incomplete country. It disarmed the most visible actor. It did not resolve the conditions that made armed conflict possible in the first place. And those conditions are still there. The state remains absent across vast rural regions. Drug trafficking remains the dominant economy in large parts of the country. Land remains concentrated. Social leaders keep dying. Young people keep being recruited. As long as that remains true, war will always have a way back, or worse, a way to stay. Colombia today is a living contradiction, a functioning democracy in its urban centers and a persistent war in its margins, a modern economy in its capitals, and an active armed conflict in its peripheries. Not on the scale of the 1990s, not at the intensity of its darkest years, but with enough force that millions of people still cannot call what they live peace. That is the real problem. Not that Colombia signed peace and lost it, but that it signed peace without resolving what made war necessary in the first place. And that is the difference between silencing a conflict and ending one. Colombia is not the story of a country that failed. It is the story of a country that has spent decades trying to solve a contradiction it still has not corrected, a nation that promises rights on paper and denies them across much of its territory, a society that has endured more than half a century of violence without fully surrendering to it. But honesty matters. The smoke rising in Cauca was not the smoke of a new war. It was the smoke of an old war that never fully burned out. And until Colombia resolves what feeds it, that smoke will keep rising. From another road, another town, another community no one noticed until it exploded.